Let's continue our discussion on bash scripting by looking at input and output. So how do we get information into and out of our script? So first we'll talk about output. And the simplest way to output something to the user is the echo command. As I said before, bash scripting is really just commands, right? You're executing commands just like you would at the command prompt. You can see here at the command prompt, you can execute the echo command, and all it does is it echoes whatever you put in. Why do we have the echo command? Really, it's mostly useful for scripting. It's not something we would normally use in the console, right? Just day to day. It's really just something for scripting so we can output information to the user. It could be the output from, the execution of various commands that we're, collecting variables, and then we have to output all this stuff to the user. It could be outputting instructions to the user or just, information about what we're doing in the script, right? So we use the echo command to do that. We kind of saw the echo command a little bit already, but one of the things about the echo command is when you pass it a variable name, it's going to output that variable name, again, depending on how you use those quotes, right? So double quotes will treat it as a string, but use substitution where it sees the $sign. If you use the single quotes, it's going to treat the whole thing as a string and not do any substitution for variables or commands. But you can also use a backslash as an escape character. So for example, if you want to output a $sign and not have it treat that $sign as the prefix to a variable, and it's in the double quotes because maybe it's a mix of things, you can use the backslash in front of the $sign. So for example, if you try to put a $sign in front of an amount that you're going to output and you want the $sign in front of it, because two $signs really means give me the process ID, what you're going to end up with is process ID and then literally the word amount after it, right? So it's probably not what you would want. So you would have to prefix it with that backslash, and then you'll have a $sign in front of the variable amount where that $sign would actually get used for substitution. There are other escape characters that are probably useful. For example, sending a bell to the user, so it just makes a beep sound, right? When you use bell, /A for the bell, /B is for a backspace, /N is for a new line, T is for a horizontal tab, V for a vertical tab, and so forth. So those could be useful for formatting the data to the user, those various, and you can also output ASCII characters. If you know the octal or hexadecimal code for an ASCII character, sometimes, you can't type it on the keyboard because the character isn't there. For example, some character sets have smiley faces and things, right? So you could output those sorts of things. So here are some examples. If you use the -E, you can see in that first example, we have hello world that it outputs. We have a list of dates. By the way, the -E is telling it to process those escape characters, right? It's saying, hey, if you see that backslash, it's an escape character that we're referencing. Don't just literally output the backslash, right? By using the -E. So you see some examples there using that. So for example, on the fourth or the third line, you have the hexadecimal characters for H, E, L, L, and O, right? So it outputs hello by using the hexadecimal equivalents. There are some other examples in the other chart below that. You have echoing a first and a last name, using the single quotes versus the double quotes, etc. And these are all also in your textbook. Here's some more examples for how to echo things. So here we have a variable called list, which has the ls command with globbing for anything that ends with .txt. Because it's in the grave, by the way, there's three types of quotes, right? We already talked about two, the double quotes and the single quotes. A third type is that grave symbol, right? That's the one that is next in the same key as the tilde key, right? That type of quote says execute whatever's inside of here, right? And the output of that is what I want in that variable. So it's going to literally execute ls space *.txt, take the output of that and stuff it into that variable. So if I echo the value of $list, it's going to be that list of files. If I echo it with double quotes around it, it's going to each have its own line because it's going to process those new lines that are part of that string or part of that list of things. You use the single quote, and then that's just going to output $list, right? Because it's going to treat it as a literal, and so forth. So input can be handled through the read command as well. I'm sorry, through the read command. So we talked about echo, which is for output, right? We're switching gears now. We're going to talk about input. So the read command is one way. It's probably the most common way to get input. Other than, the other way we talked about input was using the parameters when you call the command, right? But another method is you can ask the user to input data while the script is running. So instead of having to put in parameters when they run the command, they can enter the parameters as the command is running. You prompt them and say, enter a value for this, enter a value for that. And then it can use those variables as it goes through the script. So the syntax to read in variables is to use the read command. Here you see some examples. And it's important to understand how it works with the user entering these strings. So for example, if you use read A, it's just going to read a value into A. Whatever gets typed until they hit enter gets read into A. Now, if we do read A space B, it's looking for two variables. So when it sees white space, it's looking for the second variable. So that's important to understand. And so in that example, read AB, it's reading the first word into A, the second word into B. In many cases, if you, like, for example, if you wanted to read the full name into a variable, you might have to break this up into different parts, right? You wouldn't want to read the first name and the last name all in one shot, right? You might say, give me the first name, that's A. Give me the second name, that's B. Semantically, it might be a little bit easier for the user. They don't have to worry about names that have extra spaces and things like that. If the user puts in more data, so once you ask for, more than one variable, if the user semantically has to enter more than one thing, and they go overboard and enter extra data, it's all going to get stuffed into that last variable, right? So in the example A, B, and C, which is the second from the bottom, we're asking them for a list of numbers. A gets the number 5, B gets the number 10, C is going to get the number 15, 20, and 25. It's going to give it all three of those are going to get stored into C. Again, that may not be what you wanted, so sometimes it's easier to break this up into parts, but just so you know what the syntax is. Oh, and by the way, if you don't give it enough variables, it'll just leave it null, right? So in that last example, C is going to be null. What is null? Null means nothing. There is literally no value in that variable. It's not blank. It's not a 0. It is nothing, which is different than blank or 0, right? Blank is actually a value. 0 is actually a value. Nothing is something else entirely, which we could probably have a whole philosophical discussion about, right? All right, so if input is coming from a user via the keyboard, we should precede each input with a prompting message, right? So we should tell them, what we're asking them to enter, right? Otherwise, they're just going to see a prompt and not know what to type in there. So we're going to use that echo command to output something to tell them what to do. Then we're going to use the read command to read it in. You can see in the example down there at the bottom, if you don't use the -n, it's going to do a new line after the echo. If you put -n, that means it will not do a carriage return after it echoes the output. So that might be useful if you want everything to be on one line, for example, but then it's going to kind of cram everything together if you forget to put a space at the end of your prompt. There is a switch for the read command where you can add a prompt. So instead of having to use echo first, you could do it all in one line where you read, use -p, tell it what you want the prompt to be for the user, and then the variable that you're going to read it into. So you could use the -p to prompt the user as opposed to using echo to output some stuff. Sometimes echo is a little bit better if you're trying to output variables and things like that. So it really just depends on what you're doing, whether you would use one or the other. There's some other switches, for example, the -N, which only returns the first n characters of the input, so it might help you clean up input if you're asking for something simple, or but then again, you could also process those things with conditional logic in your script later on. And finally, if we want to input data from a file, we certainly could. This isn't terribly useful, reading in from a file. All it's going to do is when you use the read command, you can tell it to go find a file and just read the first line of that file. But at that point, you might as well just hard code it in your script, right? What's the difference between hard coding in some other file versus just hard coding it in the head of your own script, right? Maybe there are cases where you might not want to do that, but this is just another option. You could, if you really want to have a file for reading things into your script, sometimes it just makes sense to use standard input from the output of the file. So when the user executes the script, they could just pass the name of the file that has the variables, right? Is this really a whole lot different from just adding the parameters? Well, maybe if you've got a lot of parameters that you're trying to add, right? But there are other ways that we can use flat files to read in settings and so forth. You can make your own config files, and there are functions out there that you can read config files and pick out the pieces that you need using things like XML or JSON and things like that. So certainly other options out there.